Backup plans for a lot of administrators, especially administrators who are new to the job, fall into that category of changing the oil in your car, getting the tires rotated, those sorts of things. You've known and you're convinced that it's something you really should take care of because before you know it, you've chewed the front tires up because the tires haven't been rotated and it's been 11, 12,000 miles since the oil change. The same thing happens with databases because the need to perform a database restore after some sort of event or disaster or whatever you want to call it, it's not a probability. At some point, it will become an absolute certainty. The efficiency and the effectiveness of the restoration is not as certain as the fact that it's going to have to happen. Let me just give you a little piece of advice. If you're tired of your current job as a database administrator, if you're maybe bummed out by a little bit, you're burned out, and you're ready to move on to something else, here's an easy tip for you. Just ignore the importance of a database backup plan. Yeah, I'm trying to be a little bit facetious here, but understand you will see aspects of things pertaining to a backup plan on this exam, and you will deal with this in the real world. I go back to my days of database administration, and I can tell you that we were very, very judicious about creating a backup plan step by step by step. And when we first started doing these, we would go through the process of determining all the things that had to happen and the expense of it. And when we would present it to management, they would squawk it. Well, there's got to be a better way to do this. And there was always a debate until we had that first event and we went through the restoration, and it took longer than anybody expected, or it affected the business unit in ways that management just simply had not imagined. And suddenly, the budget opened up, the availability of hardware opened up, and all my years of working out there kind of in the trenches, every time we ever did a simulated failure of some kind and we went through the restore process, it always took longer than what we had anticipated for any number of reasons. But the more we did these, the better it got. The secret to a successful, efficient recovery after an event involves two main steps. First, you have to go through the step by step process of creating a backup plan. Then, make sure you understand this, you have to test that backup plan. Now, when I say test, I mean go through the process of doing a restoration from absolute ground zero. You will always find weaknesses. You'll always find surprises. And trust me, you want to find these in a test environment, not in a real world situation. Because if there's one thing I can tell you about real world situations, when you're desperately trying to get a database back up and functioning, it is amazing the people that you meet. You'll meet vice president levels, maybe even a CEO or two. It depends on how serious the situation is. What I want to talk about here in this video is how you go about creating this backup plan and how you execute it. Understand, creating a backup plan can be an extremely intimidating process that can warp your sense of safety in our world because as you work through the process of considering the possible threats and the implications of a serious data event, it becomes extremely unpleasant. And it also becomes extremely expensive, and you just have to work through this. The inability to restore critical data, trust me, is much more unpleasant than anything that you encounter as you work through creating this backup plan. The best way to begin to coalesce a good, effective, efficient, trustworthy backup plan is to ask questions. Not only ask questions, but I learned in my career to ask these questions in the meetings, to schedule these meetings, and make sure that the appropriate people with responsibility were at those meetings. And I would always write this plan up and ask them to sign it. And when you ask somebody to put their name on a plan, it is amazing the questions they start to ask and the interest they take. The questions you need to ask when you're starting to put your backup plan together. How much data loss is acceptable? We all know the answer to that question. So you go into a meeting and you get the appropriate decision makers in there and you say, okay, first question, how much data can we afford to lose? And it's going to be unanimous. We can't afford to lose any data. Well, that is certainly possible in our world with the technology and the hardware that we have. But the question starts to become, well, okay, now how often does data in our database change? And if we can't afford any data loss, then we're going to have to implement some sort of plan that's doing some pretty regular and efficient backups. What's an acceptable recovery time? It's that old thing about there's three options, pick any two. An acceptable recovery time is going to affect the budget, it's going to affect the backup times, it's going to affect a lot of things. How big is the database maintenance window? If we want to recover very quickly, then we're going to have to back up a lot. And we're going to have to make sure we have the time and the availability on the system to get the data backed up in a form that we can quickly recover it, or vice versa. Also, how large is the database and how much is it growing every month, quarter, whatever? And then the big one, what is the budget for database backup and recovery? So if absolutely no data loss is acceptable, and if the database is under constant modification, and if the acceptable recovery time is very short and the database maintenance window is very short, then we've really got to spend some money on hardware and preparation. And so all of these things have to kind of balance out. And that is where it gets dicey when you're putting together a backup plan. Now, the combined answer to these questions will absolutely solidify the reality and the need for a backup plan. Two questions in particular will bring the real world impact into very sharp, crisp focus. I've seen it, I don't know how many times in meetings. First, how much data loss is acceptable? And then second, what is the budget for the database backup and recovery? One other thing I've noticed out there in the real world, the budget was limited for database backup and recovery hardware and functionalities and the time to test them and so forth until that first failure happens. Then these questions change. The questions change after the first test of the plan, when it takes a lot longer than you estimated to get the database back up and running under certain scenarios. Then the question starts to get, well, wait a minute. In a real world environment, we can't take 5.5 hours to get our data back up. Keep in mind, we have cloud technologies and virtual technologies now that help. But even though we get into those things and we can do clustering, we've got licensing costs on the cluster nodes, and we've got other things taken into consideration, disk space, hardware, and so forth. Then the first real data event will really start to change the answer to the questions of what's our budget, what's our time constraints, what's our realistic expectations. The three most important aspects of a good backup plan are pretty simple. You have to have the assignment of backup responsibilities to a specific individual or team. I don't know how many times in the real world, as an employee, as a consultant, I've sat and watched some pretty sad situations where someone was supposed to be performing backups and they started getting backups that failed 3 or 4 times a week, and they never really got a chance to chase that down. And before you know it, they're 3 weeks behind on backups, and you guessed it, that's when some sort of failure occurs. So you want to make sure someone has that responsibility. Let me back up here just a moment. Not only to perform the backups, but also to test the restoration off of those backups. Your backup is not a backup plan until you've seen a successful recovery. Step-by-step directions for backup and recovery actions are needed. They need to be printed out. They need to be documented in detail. They need to be in a location where everyone can find them. There needs to be contact information for anybody that we need to contact that has the authority to okay certain actions or certain shortcuts or any kind of expenses. We need all of that information, all those contact numbers, everything there. If there's any particular software that's going to be required to restore anything, we want to know where that copy is. It really should be in the binder with that. So we just want to make sure that everything's covered. So in the event of a failure and we start the recovery process, we just simply go down the checklist quickly and efficiently, and everything is at our fingertips. We also want to make sure that we test the entire solution. You never want to go into a real world failure and be implementing a brand new solution that you've never tested. Back in the days of tape backups, we've all experienced, if you were there in the tape backup days, all kinds of real nice backups. They were labeled very neatly. They were in order. The problem was we just couldn't read the data off the tape. We want to test the solution. How long do backups take? How long does a complete restore recovery take? And can we get to our data at the end of this process? So there's a lot to consider. The backup plan is the beginning to a successful restoration. You got to have it, and you have to plan it, and you have to implement it correctly.